Okay, so we're going to get started here. If everybody could take a seat. My name is David Germano from the Department of Religious Studies and Contemplative Science Center, and I'm just going to give you a brief introduction today to our talk and our visiting lecturer, Professor Kate Crosby. The talk today is part of the Contemplative Science Center lecture series and also the Nelson Family Lectures on Southeast Asia. So Kate is currently Professor of Buddhist Studies at King's College in London, and she's been there for the past 4 years, and prior to that she had a position at the School of Oriental and African Studies, or SOAS, also in London. And she's published 4 books. The first is a translation of one of the great classics of Indian Buddhism, the Bodhicharya Avatara. The second book is a translation of the great epic of India, the Mahabharata, very different topic, in case you missed that. And then the third book is a wide-ranging look at Theravada Buddhism all across Asia, called Continuity, Diversity, and Identity. And the fourth book, which is the relevant subject for today, is Traditional Theravada Meditation and its Modern Era Suppression. She's worked extensively since 1990 in doing field work all across Asia and Sri Lanka and Cambodia in particular, but also other parts of Southeast Asia, in addition to having a really deep knowledge of Sanskrit and Pali, the canonical languages for the Buddhist traditions that she studies. And one of the ways, or a thread, to think about her work and how it's been tied together over the years is a focus on underrepresented or underreported areas of Theravada Buddhism, a tradition that at times we think we know very well. And yet Kate's work in particular has been showing this amazing diversity, or these amazing other sides of the tradition that throw our assumptions into question. And I think this most recent book and the discussion that she'll be giving today is really quite groundbreaking. I think it's one of the most innovative looks at Buddhist meditation in the scholarly context that's happened over the past 15 years, because it really takes the kind of normative position, both within the region in Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka, and also in the international scholarly community, and basically turns it on its head. And I think this exemplifies a number of the values that at the Contemplative Science Center we've been trying to put forth with regards to the value and character of how you do scholarship on meditation. And I just wanted to offer 5 thoughts about that. One is that it's deeply contextual. We often think meditation is something that we can pull out of context, that it's about these extraordinary techniques and experiences, and we miss the fact that it's about people's lives in all their messiness, both individual lives and collective lives, communities, political institutions, cultures. And her work is putting this meditation back where it belongs in the context of how people live their lives in these individual and collective ways. Another one is that it shows us the importance of doing the history of contemplative practices. It's not something that is timeless. It's something that's completely bound up with historical circumstances and a broad variety of agendas. And this goes hand in hand with the questioning of assumptions, because we can't say that Theravada Buddhist meditation or Catholic meditation or really any form of contemplation that this is what it is. That's a normative statement. It only relates to a particular time and place and agenda. And so her work is really showing how quintessentially that's true, and the value of taking a historical perspective on these things. Then finally, that it's not just about norms, but it's also about individual difference. And that individual difference can boil down to a single person, but also to a particular place and time. And also questioning norms, because norms are also constantly changing in character, and they have their own history. So, and the final thing I'll just say, because over the last couple of years, not years, days, it seems like years, last couple of days as I've been getting to know Kate and talk to her, she's an extremely human person, which I must say is not always the case when you have someone of her scholarly attributes coming here to visit us. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce her today to share her most recent work on the history of Theravada meditation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much for coming here to listen to me today in this very English environment with this rain all night. I'm going to be looking at kind of the big picture of Theravada meditation as I see it, and looking at it as a technology and what happens when the kind of dominant technologies change. So I'm looking in particular at a strand of meditation that started to disappear in the 1920s. And at that point, it gets called the old tradition, because there are new traditions coming in. New traditions from Burma and new traditions within Thailand, developed with much closer reference to canonical and commentarial texts. Just to remind you of the kind of area we're looking at, so I'm looking within Theravada, and I'm looking particularly at Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Sri Lanka, because I can find manuscript evidence and some inscriptional evidence for this meditation practice in these areas, particularly the 18th and 19th centuries. And what I want to look at is what's going on when we talk about meditation in this period, because obviously we associate meditation with this calm appearance, but often quite a lot of activity is going on behind that calm appearance. And one of the difficulties of looking at this tradition is that we can see quite easily when we read a text the topics of meditation, the things we're meditating on. And there's in Theravada a standard list of 40 plus topics, things like breathing, things like the kasana traditions, the coloured lights that you meditate on, things like decomposing bodies. So there's a standard list with some variation. And but what differs in this practice relates to the techniques. And there are a number of different techniques that you can use in meditation, such things as the whole ritual and devotional context that allow you to receive the meditation, allow you to feel you have the right to practice the meditation, gives you a sense of what the path is that you're trying to follow. Breathing as well as a focus can be a kind of technique. Things like directive or non-directive meditation practices, where you're prescribed what you're supposed to do or whether it's open. Things like this that are about how you do it, not about the topic itself. And what we find in this type of meditation is that what you're doing is you're manipulating meditation outcomes, the so-called nimitta, the eidetic signs, the visual and physical responses to meditation, and you're going to use them to transform the body. So it's a somatic practice. And so what's unusual in this, perhaps, is that the body, which we may think of as an object of meditation in Vipassana, for example, you watch changes in the body. Here it's the subject of meditation, it's the thing you're going to change. Okay. This is a tiny blue Burmese sapphire. It's about the size of the end of my finger. And I use it to remind myself about the way a certain symbol is used differently in different contexts. So this is housed in the Natural History Museum in London. And it came there as a gem, as a tie-pin. This is on a tie-pin. And so that was the use that it was put to by presumably a British colonial officer or his wife in 19th century Burma. But originally, it was obviously used in a religious way, possibly in the hat of a meditation practitioner. Now, obviously that seems like a misappropriation, something used for a spiritual path, and then gets used in the West for something more instrumental. But I use it partly to remind myself that in Asia as well, meditation is not just about the spiritual path, it is also instrumental. And the practice I'm going to be looking at has some very clear instrumental applications that are still familiar to us today. Okay. Now, the Brahmakammatthana, the ancient meditation tradition, uses these signs that these experiences in meditation and brings them into the body. And if you look at the manuscripts from this tradition, we have much more manuscript evidence than living evidence. It has these diagrams on how to place these things in the body. This is a Sri Lankan manuscript, and at the bottom it says Nabiam, place this in near your navel, and you're bringing 3 different nimittas on top of each other and you're combining them. And you combine them, you bring them into the body. If you're a man, you bring them through your right intranasal cavity, down into the back of the throat, the heart, the navel, and to 2 fingers width from the navel. And if you are a woman, you'll bring them down the left-hand side of the body, down into the navel. In the text it says into your womb. Whether you're male or female, you're placing these qualities into your womb or in other parts of the body. And you're doing them in combination. So one of the distinctive things about this meditation is that you start usually with joy. A piti it's called in Pali. It's a component of the first jhana, the first altered state, higher state achieved in meditation. And it divides it into 5, and you're bringing these 5 into the body and you're ordering them in different ways. And so you'll see diagrams like this in the text, in the manuscripts. And you might see them saying this is the first of these joys, the second of these joys, but you may also see like this. And here you've got syllables. The syllables are Namo Buddhaya. These are 5 syllables meaning homage to the Buddha. That's the exoteric meaning. The esoteric meaning is that these represent 5 things, and they differ, but here it's the 5 joys. And so it's a way of using what we call letter alchemy. So these letters represent certain qualities, whatever you've assigned them to in your practice. And by bringing them into the body, by manipulating them, you're bringing in the things they represent. So letter alchemy. And then the diagrams in the text will show you how to manipulate them further, moving them in and out, many combinations, many different arrangements. So in the main meditation manual from Sri Lanka I've worked on, it's a text that's about 3,800 verses long, and each verse is in code, and the code tells you which manipulations you're doing, maybe about 20 manipulations per verse. So there's often like 76,000 or something, I can't quite do the maths, different movements you're going to use. And these movements follow specific patterns, specific mathematical sequences. Some of them occur in things like chess moves and things like that traditionally as well. And you find them used not just in this practice, but also in certain applications. So tattoos are very interesting in Southeast Asia. They were traditionally used to show ownership or belonging. So if you belong to one particular lord's army or staff or something like that, you have a distinctive tattoo. So they show a kind of ownership. And it's thought that they give protection in several ways. So when they were used for some kind of inoculation, the idea is that you were taking the power of the god, the smallpox god or whatever, and taking some of that onto your skin for protection. So you now have some kind of relationship with that god, and that gives you protection. We might understand that protection in different ways, by having a small dose of this inoculation on the skin. And some people have had tattoos, and I think that's how they are protected from illness. So the small doses you get of saliva and this kind of thing into the tattoo through the thinned skin maybe gives you protection. Another way is through letter alchemy. So this tattoo, this rather famous now tattoo in Cambodian letters, it's done in a particular order. These days, you can buy a book and you can copy this order. But traditionally, this is done by a specialist in how nimitta need to be moved around to enhance their power. So you do it in a way to create density. If you look at somebody who's been tattooed a lot, they will have I think it's my phone or somebody else's, okay. If you look at somebody who's been tattooed a lot, they will have an almost black look to them, because the more dense you apply these combinations, the greater the protection. And I'll come back to that later. Okay. In the case of Angelina Jolie, what's unusual about her tattoo is that as a woman, she's had it done in ink so that you can see it. Traditionally, women would have had this done in oil so that you can't see it, it doesn't change your appearance. And to study female tattoos, you need to use like an infrared light. Okay. But the person has used particular orderings of letters. Those letters represent certain qualities and thereby give protection to the person wearing the tattoo. Okay. How you use this in other ways, so in meditation, you're using these combinations to bring these nimitta down into the body, down the pathways that are familiar from Ayurvedic medicine, and then moving them around. The model on the left, this is a modern model from one of the living traditions in Thailand. So it's in the temple to show some of the movements. On the right, there was the Supreme Patriarch of Thailand, so the head monk of Thailand, practiced at that temple at the end of the 18th, early 19th century. And this is a medical manual using the same signs moved around the body to clarify imbalances in the three humours in order to restore health. And so practitioners who can do this meditation are also thought to be able to heal both themselves and others using this technique. There's a modernized form of this, which rather than allowing the nimittas, these signs to appear within you, prescribes what you should do. And this is the Dhammakaya movement in Bangkok. This is so very widely accessible, this modernized form. And they give illustrations of the pathway of bringing this sign into the body. You may be asking why there's a picture of English church bells there. When I was trying to understand this method, it's a physical method, but it uses group theory maths. And I was trying to get my head around what this would be like. And I looked around to see what happened when, 1,000 years later, after this type of maths emerged in Asia, was introduced into Britain through Europe from the Islamic world. And one of the things that England ended up with was change ringing of church bells. And that uses the same maths, where you are basically going through as many of the possible permutations from a set number in order to complete the entire range of possibilities. So it's using the same math. So I went and learned how to ring church bells to try and understand Southeast Asian meditation. Okay. So I just want to do now a kind of summary of the techniques. This isn't a complete list of the techniques used, just to give an idea. So again, it's a somatic practice where you're bringing these qualities of meditation. So first of all, you've gained facility in producing these visual and physical experiences, and you're bringing them into the body. And you're using your intranasal cavity for the delivery of them, just like in medicine. I'll come to that shortly. And you're doing that, you bring them in, you bring them out in reverse, you bring in multiple ones, you combine them, increasing the density of these qualities in your body. And the outcome of this, the soteriological outcome, so the outcome in relation to nirvana, is that you're creating a body within, a Buddha body within. And so the language is specifically in terms of creating a Buddha within the womb. Now, this seems very different from some of the Theravada meditation we're more familiar with. So I want to now step back and think, what is it similar to within the pre-modern Theravada world? And there are various technologies that are using some similar methods for completely different ends. One of them is generative grammar. Now, in this tradition, the narratives and some of the terminology of generative grammar is everywhere. Okay. What's generative grammar? This is the form of grammar used in Sanskrit and Pali, where you start off with short roots, just sort of imagined or theoretical forms of language, and you apply suffixes and code letters and procedures to create the entirety of the language. So rather than descriptive grammar, saying what language, what forms we find, it says you can create the entirety of the language from these basic roots. And so you have a relatively small set of roots and then a list of rules and codes to apply to those roots to create all of grammar. And it uses a form of substitution where you apply, where you keep replacing things. So I might replace a certain quality, like one of these joys that I'm going to bring into the body, with the letter N. And then the quality goes into that letter. So when I then manipulate the letter N, I'm manipulating the quality. So it doesn't matter that I've replaced it, the quality transfers. And the language of Sanskrit grammar, generative grammar, is used in these meditation practices and is used in the creation of tattoos and is used in the creation of sacred powder, things like this. Another aspect of another technology that we find here is the technology of Abhidhamma, particularly, so Abhidhamma is the kind of analysis of causality, particularly about positive and negative ethical and mental states. And the last book of the Abhidhamma Pitaka in Theravada looks specifically at how you combine different aspects to get a positive or negative outcome. And it does so using group theory maths. And because all the possible combinations of positive and negative physical and psychological mental states is too numerous to write down, that work, that seventh book of the Abhidhamma Pitaka, has never been written down. What they do is give mathematical examples by saying this combination, do this combination, and then you have to apply it to other things. So it's using the same kind of mathematics that we find in this meditation technique. Something that also uses that mathematics is Ayurvedic pharmaceuticals. So in Ayurveda, you are treating illness by treating imbalances in the so-called humours, often translated humours, in the body. So you need to, when you're using a medicine, it needs to be in the right combination of constituents to match the imbalance. Yeah? So you've got your three humours in the body, sometimes a longer list, three humours in combination with the 5 elements of the body, and you need pharmaceutical substance in the correct combination to apply to the illness. And you can use the intranasal cavity to apply these medicines, and you're particularly going to do so if you're treating the baby in the womb, so in obstetrics. And one of the classic ones is if you want to change the nature of the baby, say the character, whether you want somebody who's going to be a good warrior or somebody who's going to be a good scholar, or you want to change between male and female. If you want to change to a male, you need to use your right hand nostril, or if you want to treat a male baby in the womb, use your right hand nostril and take the medicine, apply the medicine, pulverized form often, through the nasal down into the body. And if you're treating a female child or want a female child, you will use the left hand nostril. Another place we see this use of mathematics and also this repeat back and forth application is in alchemy. So for the purification of mercury and gold, particularly in mercury, so the repeated infusion of mercury into sulfur. I'm going to return to that, but that repeated practice you see in the purification. And so you see both the language and also the practice of repeated infusion in this tradition of meditation that you also see in mercury purification. And again, the mathematics that is shared across all these traditions. So what we see then is that this meditation, the techniques used in it, resonate with other technologies in the culture at the time when this was the dominant form of meditation in the countries I've studied. And I found particularly useful people who've shown similar resonances between tantric practice and obstetrics and alchemy. And if you think about it, it makes sense as a metaphor. You're creating a new being. So it's like purifying the metal or generating a baby within. And I found particularly useful an article by David Gordon White, Why Gurus Are Heavy, looking at the detail of the parallels between alchemy practice, so purifying mercury, and the language of sexual intercourse, but also generation of a child, and tantra. And so he talks about these being mutually informing and enriching. I've just summarized a quotation from him there, just describing this parallel. So he says, the mercury, the male, penetrates the sulfur, the female, the body, and other female elements, and absorbs into itself the power residing in the female, the sulfur. So the less subtle elements. The mercury emerges from the crucible, reborn from the womb of the female elements. Purification is repeated to get greater density and greater impenetrability. So just like our tattoos, but also like this process of bringing the mitta in and out of the body. It's increasing the purity and the density of the purified person within. So what Gordon White's talking about there is where you've got technologies that resonate with each other in the culture. So there's the tantric practices he's been looking at in Shaivism, and there's alchemy. And what I want to look at now is what happens when the resonances cease to exist. So when the technologies such as alchemy, Ayurvedic medicine, cease to be the dominant technologies in society, what happens to the meditation that uses the same forms of techniques? So one thing that interests me, why I started looking at this, is that we see this form of meditation, this somatic bringing in of these signs, as the form of meditation when a reform happens in Buddhism. In the mid-18th century, so in Sri Lanka, Buddhism is under threat because of first the Portuguese and then the Dutch colonial presence. This is before the British colonial period. And so they send requests for help from different Buddhist countries that still have a king and still have a thriving Buddhist practice. And the king of Siam of Thailand at the time sends over 3 missions of Buddhist monks. And the middle one, the second mission, has meditating monks. And the meditating monks stay there for 8 years to teach the local monks who copy down the instructions in these very long texts, so very complex texts. And it's those manuscripts that eventually, as the monks died, as the practice fell into disuse, ended up in temple libraries, in collectors' libraries, and that's why I've been able to access them. So at that period of reform, to revive Buddhism, this practice was taken as being completely orthodox, and it's what monks from around the island learned to do. But there were later reforms, including in Sri Lanka, and they again sent for help from Burma and Thailand. But by that time, in Burma and Thailand, meditation practices had changed. Okay. So it's not part of later reforms. So why is it changing? This is just some of the physical remains we have from that reintroduction of Buddhism from Thailand. So cave temples, meditation temples, and the honouring of the monks who'd been ordained in the new system by the king of central Sri Lanka at the time. Okay. Now, what's curious for me is that this was a text from this meditation practice was actually one of the earliest, if not the earliest, meditation text to be translated from the Theravada area into English. And at the time, they thought there was no living tradition in Sri Lanka. That may or may not have been true. Because of the colonial divide, we know that there were strong living traditions still in Thailand and Cambodia and Laos, but because of the divide between French and British colonial areas, the British scholars working on this didn't study what was going on in those areas. So they thought it had died out, and at that time, understanding of meditation is very different from what it is today, and it was included under general mysticism, and we find it being dismissed. Now remember, this is before the popularization of Vipassana. So one of the scholars wrote, it may very well be that a text with the language of the 17th century or even the 16th century, but that at that time Buddhism in Ceylon was so decadent that there could not have been much samadhi or jhana practice among the monks. So it was an assumption that monks didn't know what they were doing. Again, with the revival, so this type of meditation is not part of the later revival in the 1950s of meditation in Sri Lanka. And one of the most important monks for revival and meditation in Sri Lanka says this is not a method of meditation, so he's looking at the text. And then a scholar studying this in the 1980s says, an imaginative but not very insightful attempt to revive meditation from the text. For the text seem to have been treated as repositories of magical lore. Let's look a bit further back into attitudes towards meditation. But first, we have to set this in the context of what's happening with those other technologies. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact of Western knowledge systems on Asian knowledge systems at the time. And the most obvious example is what's happening with traditional understandings of cosmology. So in Burmese, this is a Burmese picture of cosmology, but Southeast Asian Buddhist cosmology, as everywhere you've got a human realm, below you've got hells, above you've got heavens, and you've got these rings of mountains, and now suddenly they're confronted with the heliocentric model of the universe. And this has a big impact on people having to reevaluate what they read in Buddhist texts. You also have the military success of colonial war in Southeast Asia. And later we're going to get medical success, not at the early stage. And so you have this sense of a physical supremacy of European colonial soldiers and presence, and this idea that Europe has a superior control of the physical world. And so a kind of capitulation in areas of the physical. We're also going to see loss of patronage, I'll come back to that, and competition in areas such as medicine. And another thing is the whole theory about what's going on, the whole way of defending colonialism, and this imposition of social Darwinism. One of the significant things of social Darwinism is just partly the justification of war, those who survive, survival of the fittest, using Darwinian terms, but also the understanding of progress as being in one direction. You know? And so these wars are necessary because they're going to bring European progress. And what you find with that is the dismissal of knowledge systems in Asia generally. You know? So we're going to bring in European knowledge systems. And that idea that progress is unidirectional, that we're heading towards progress in a particular direction, we're going to arrive at some more advanced system, that's quite common even today. We tend to think in that way. Let's place this in what then people thought about Buddhism, the colonial attitudes to Buddhism. People valued the Buddha as a kind of philosopher. Yeah? Philosophy is way of life. They equated it with like Socrates, and particularly preferred art that took the related Buddhism to the Roman and Greek culture. But they didn't appreciate what practitioners were doing. So we have this kind of split response to Buddhism. So Max Muller, famous Orientalist scholar, was amazed by the way that Christian missionaries even would speak positively about the Buddha as found in the text. So he says, "Now it has been the peculiar fate of the religion of Buddha that among all the so-called false or heathenish religions, it almost alone has been praised by all and everyone for its elevated, pure, and humanizing character." So that aspect is appreciated. However, we have other people writing, Buddhism as he taught it, as the Buddha taught it, is not the religion of the 500 millions who are said to reverence his shrines. And then Sri Lankan, who's converted to Christianity, with the growth of intelligence through mission schools in Sri Lanka and the increase of scientific knowledge, the Sinhalese will ere long perceive the errors of Buddhism and adopt the religion of the Bible. And I particularly like this quotation. This is by Bishop of Colombo, and he wrote a best-selling book on Theravada Buddhism. And about meditation, he said this: "There are, it is true, many passages, especially among those that deal with meditation, which entirely leave behind all that is human, natural, probable, all that is genial or attractive, and sail away into a region of empty abstraction, which it would be a flattery to call the cloudland." Okay. So for him, meditation isn't part of early Buddhism. It's a later corruption, which is almost the opposite of what we think now. Now when you're teaching Buddhism, people assume that meditation is actually a really important part of it. Okay, so those attitudes then, and I just want to remind us about things that demonstrate that progress is not unidirectional. And I'm going to take examples that are relevant to this meditation, and I'm going to take examples that do not relate specifically to things of the spirit or the mind. These are things that affect the physical world as well. One is generative grammar. It was studied and appreciated by textual scholars, but not applied in any way until the 1950s, when it has this huge impact on programming language. So it affects computer programming. Another is the intranasal delivery of pharmaceuticals. I'm going to come back to that a bit more, but basically it was dismissed in favor of the techniques that were more familiar, such as direct into the blood, or oral consumption of pharmaceuticals. But since the 1980s, we've seen an increase in study of this topic because of the possibility of bypassing the blood-brain barrier if you use the intranasal cavity. And we're also using more treatments through the skin, like tattooing. Another one, which is kind of a question mark for me, is that we have in Theravada this extraordinary analysis of the conditionality of positive and negative mental states and characters. We don't have anything in parallel in the West, and quite often we only see something and its value when we've developed something that's similar enough to make the connection. So I don't know whether there will be some kind of changes when Abhidhamma is looked at in a different way. Okay. Now I want to go back to a medical example, because this is quite significant for the disappearance of this meditation. I want to look at smallpox, which is very well documented. And as I think most people will know, that smallpox prevention came to America from Africa, and I think through slaves, and it came to Europe from Asia. And so initially, we've got inoculations where you use basically the dried scabs, smallpox scabs, and you use that to give people a lower dose of smallpox, and they develop a resistance. But then in the very end of the 18th century, we have Jenner finding that you can use cowpox to create a vaccine that then prevents smallpox. And you probably the reason this expertise was being developed there in Britain was because the British were using smallpox as a weapon. So they infected Native Americans with smallpox. They used it in some of the colonial wars in North America. So initially, before the introduction of vaccination, there was a competition over how to inoculate, whether you do it through the intranasal cavity with dried scabs, as tradition done, or whether you do it through the skin or into the blood. So that was the competition between whether the Asian system or the European system was better, and the problems with using the blood or the skin is you might infect with something else, such as the great pox. So the great pox of syphilis. When vaccine using cowpox came in, it was very problematic. So the British tried to impose it in Burma, for example, but they had problems with the stability of the lymph from cattle. And so there was a kind of clash of culture. So Burmese preferred to carry on using this method of using the scab of smallpox. So it was something that there was a competition in the area of medicine. It eventually was in Thailand that the successful use of vaccination, combined with Thailand's process of modernization, meant that vaccination came to be accepted. And we can follow that. So there's a institution set up in Thailand for things like vaccination, for snake antidotes, and Thailand had been centralizing its bureaucracy in the way of staying independent of France and Britain, and everybody had to have vaccination certificates to get through school, centralized on Bangkok. So we have a centralized system of distributing Western-derived medicine. When we look at Buddhism, we tend to associate the reform of Buddhism, so the dismissal of this ancient method of meditation, with this king here, King Mongkut. He's the king from the King and I, the play. And he is, yes, very westernized in a certain sense. He's educated in both traditional Buddhism and the new Western sciences. And he is also wanting to reject the Sangha hierarchy, so the hierarchy of monks that he was under as a prince, in order to set up his own tradition of Buddhism where everybody's loyal to him. So it's very important for me when looking at developments in Theravada to look not just at the big picture of politics, but also at the monastic politics, so the rivalry between different monks and different monasteries, because that tells us quite a lot. And so he was using a kind of, back to the text, a fundamentalist version of Buddhism to dismiss the older generation of monks that he didn't want to be under. And he was using his new tradition of Buddhism as a kind of power base. And so when Sri Lankans were worried about Buddhism in Sri Lanka, they went to him for help. You know, he was one of the people who went to for help. So Buddhism started changing then, but it was really his grandson, I think, King Vajirarud, who affected the disappearance of this tradition more fundamentally. Because what he did was ban traditional medicine. And this meditation practice is used both for meditation, for transforming the individual on the path to Buddhahood, but also for medical treatments. So I think in one go he removed a large area of people's income, practitioners' income. And we can follow the presence of Western medicine and the disappearance of this practice. So if we look at the 18th century, when there's virtually no presence of Western medicine, it hadn't developed as such to be exported in the area. Early colonialists were very much dependent on local medical practitioners. And we find this meditation everywhere. I haven't studied in Burma, but in the areas I've studied, we find evidence of this meditation. Then, as we find Western medicine imposed from the center in Bangkok, we find it disappearing, find the meditation disappearing. In Cambodia, we find in Phnom Penh that medicine's being greatly affected by what's going on in Bangkok. And the French have set up Louis Pasteur Institute to provide vaccinations there. But they don't have the same transport and centralized control over the regions. You do find that the monks, the young monks who are coming to the top in Cambodia under the French, who are learning Pali under the French, they are very dismissive of these practices. And they are bringing in a modernized form of Buddhism with French support as their own kind of power base. Okay. So what you find then is that this form of meditation is dominant still in the rural areas of Cambodia and Laos. And then what happens in the 1970s is the Marxist revolution. You find monks are forcibly defrocked, killed, and so you find practitioners of this disappearing and people being made to move, so everything disrupted. And so the areas where we had this meditation are the areas that are also most affected by political changes and war in this area. And now, when I'm trying to find living practitioners, it's extremely difficult. And even where I find them, the practices change. So people who were interviewed in the early 1990s, elderly people in their 80s and 90s, they could remember very physical practices connected with this. But I have not found any physical, strongly physical practices. You're still bringing the nirvana in, but you're not doing related physical practices. There have been attempts to save the tradition. So this is one of the teachers we found. He was too deaf to be able to teach, but he was still practicing and in high demand for his ability as a ritual specialist. So we find him cycling along the little path between the rice fields to get to the next ritual he was performing. And he had preserved many of the manuscripts. He's holding the manuals which tell the practitioner what these signs mean to remind them when they're instructing people. And we found some nuns practicing. This nun here is the one I ended up living with, and I worked in the same practice. And she's looking at the screen showing her what's been going on in Thailand with this practice. And this is the way I use to try and get access and to get people to talk to me about the detail, because just talking about the topics, those are general Theravada topics. It's the system you use. But she was very reluctant to talk about it initially, because even in Cambodia, the Vipassana, Burmese Vipassana, has become the new orthodoxy. So when there's been a revival of Buddhism after the end of the Khmer Rouge period, the meditation revival has been taken from outside. It's not from the Cambodian tradition. One of the reasons for that is how accessible it is. Another is the response of the Cambodian older generation to the old method. They were trying to reject it. So why did Burmese Vipassana become so popular? It's partly because of the skill of people like Lady Sayadaw, the famous monk Lady Sayadaw, in the way they treated meditation as a science of the mind. And this meant that they, in a way, protected it, or went around this idea of the colonial dominance of the physical world and the physical body. And in terms of the scientific attitudes of the time, we have this strong divide between the physical realm and the realm of the psyche, which is not subject to science at the time. Obviously, that's changed hugely since. And so he even wrote a book where he categorized different sciences in Burma in a kind of hierarchy, with this meditation practice at the highest end of the hierarchy of sciences, so above other sciences. Okay, so we have the kind of modernizing of the Burmese tradition, the popularization of meditation and other Buddhist practices to try and protect Buddhism under the threat of decay under the British colonial rule, and at the same time a changing of meditation practice to make it far more about a mind science rather than a physical practice. And obviously what we've seen since is the acceptance of that mind science and then the treatment of it. So this is a chart just showing the huge increase between 1980 and 2013. I mean, we know a lot more about this uptake of Western medicine. So this is the use of mindfulness in scientific publications. But in terms of the traditional Theravada meditation, so that came to be called the ancient method, in contrast to practices like Burmese Vipassana, it disappeared really before that interest in looking at what the effects of meditation are and whether those can be taken out of context and applied to other benefits more broadly. So what's then the effect? So this is what tends to happen now. This on the left is an image from a manuscript, and we discovered a really important collection of manuscripts in a Thai temple connected with one of the previous kings of Thailand. And the man who looks after them is very well known for his magical powers, and he grinds down those manuscripts into the amulets here that people like to have and wear on their body for protection. So one of the effects of the disappearance of this system, this somatic system, is that when we see something like tattooing, we tend to see it as being on a different level. It is Buddhism, Buddhist magic. Yeah? It's not on the same plane as the soteriological practice about enlightenment, gaining enlightenment. But if we think in terms of this tradition, we can see that what they were doing is trying to apply technologies to ensure that the qualities taught in Buddhist texts and Buddhist doctrines were somehow made real in the physical body, because this is what we've got to change. And so how can we actually do it? How can we ensure change? And they developed a system that resonated with, you could say based on, but perhaps these things developed in parallel, resonated with other technologies of change at the time, particularly obstetrics and chemistry, the chemistry of the time. And we see that things like tattooing were using the same methods. And it's only when this disappears as a method for gaining enlightenment that it looks as if Theravada Buddhists have somehow adopted in some kind of magical practices from outside. So if we take this system as representative of Theravada, Theravada looks like a holistic tradition with practices that can be applied in different areas, but that have a similar technological base. The other effect of the loss of this tradition is, of course, the loss of potential applications. Now, I don't know what those potential applications might be. Certainly people in the tradition report on certain physical changes and certain emotional, psychological changes. Whether one can take those out of context, whether there's even a sufficient body of practice to test now, I don't know. But it has a huge effect on whether how we see Theravada and how we see Theravada meditation.